This morning is our,
Oh, sorry.
okay, I'm pleased to introduce Amanda Stone as our speaker this morning. Moving from the Show Me State, Missouri, Amanda resides in South Durham with her husband and two puppy children. When not working at the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough, you can find Amanda hiking among the pines and discovering the area's rich history. Obtaining her bachelor's in exercise science and a master's degree in kinesiology, Amanda has spent the last 13 years growing a personal training company and operating a fitness franchise. With the sale of her business, Amanda was able to seek out new adventures, leading her to explore her interest in history and preservation. In her free time, Amanda takes on freelance projects, writing for the News of Orange and composing a book about the newly renovated Colonial Inn. So she's going to be sharing stories of the Colonial Inn from the last 183 years of history. That's a lot to cover, Amanda. Go for it.
Okay. Well, it's nice to meet everyone. Do we want to do a screen share for the PowerPoint, Carolyn?
Doris, are you going to put do you know how to screen share from your Zoom, Amanda?
Oh, I got it.
Okay.
It says host disabled.
Doris, do you
It's
have
also okay. Okay. I think she said I should. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Can everyone see?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. All right. Like Carolyn said, I'm Amanda Boyd, and my previous career has nothing to do with what I do now. But when I had the opportunity to change careers, then I sort of took the leap and haven't looked back since. So it's been really fun. And one of the major projects that I worked on is the Colonial Inn, which is a historic landmark that's located in downtown Hillsborough. So if you're unfamiliar, then I encourage you to check it out because it's really cool. And it just reopened. So I'm going to just kind of talk a little bit about the Colonial Inn, so you have some history of it, and then I'll talk just a small bit about the book and then answer any questions that you have. So the Colonial Inn is obviously one of the many historic properties of Hillsborough, which, I mean, downtown Hillsborough in itself, you could walk around and throw a stone and you'd hit something that's old. So it's not too hard. But I first laid eyes on her in about 2017. And it looked like it was barely standing. I kind of roamed around and peeked into the windows like someone does when something's abandoned, imagining kind of the life that used to be in there. The front steps, which are stone, were roped off because they were crumbling. The foundation was a disaster. It was just really dilapidated. And then you go around the back side, and the back half of the property or the building had been somewhat torn off, like they were in mid-construction. And in the middle of the room, which now I know to be the dining room, stood a black baby grand piano, and it was positioned under one of the last remaining chandeliers hanging from like the sagging ceiling. So it was fascinating to me because it was kind of like one of those abandoned places you would see on social media where somebody just left, and your mind just kind of wondered, what were the parties like? What was it like? And as a transplant, I had no idea. So I started doing a little investigation via Google. I was like, what is this Colonial Inn about? And I discovered a Facebook group, which I'll later talk about. And it's where people came together and they started sharing stories. And so it was talking about, I stayed at the inn for my anniversary, or I shared a meal. And it was just this community of love coming together. And it seemed like that the structure was like a pivotal landmark for both the town and people outside of it. So anybody that was able to experience the Colonial Inn. And that was something I had never seen before, this whole group of strangers rallying behind it and that community driven spirit. So I got me even more curious. So I did a little bit of digging. So again, the overview in a nutshell, the Colonial Inn has stood in the heart of downtown Hillsborough since 1838. If you have been to Hillsborough, you know the sign gives a 1759 date, which we can talk about in a little bit. But this iconic building it's been a meeting place and an event center. It's helped during the Civil War efforts. It's withstood fires and hurricanes and a ton of bankruptcy. And so after being closed for about 20 years, the Colonial Inn has finally been restored and reopened. Okay, so this screen just shows a timeline, which is really overwhelming. So you can kind of read through it. There is an error. This is so unfortunate because this is from the book and my eyes and the editor's eyes did not catch it. But if you go to the left hand, it says 1872, in middle of the 1800s. That's supposed to be 1872. So we didn't just skip 100 years. It was just a typo. But since its inception, it's had 17 different owners. There was a man, David C. Parks, that owned it actually twice. So he was twice crazy. And it's been through multiple expansions. So the timeline takes you through a little bit of that. It's also been a few different names, which we'll talk about in just a second as well. But what's really cool when you go into the Colonial Inn is that the original footprint of the building can still be experienced. So when you walk in the doors, the lobby that you're standing in, and then there's a bar area to your left, that's all original 1838. And they did their best to preserve what they can. So the floors, one of the fireplaces was salvaged. They were even able to expose some of the studs that were used that in the 1800s they would have done by hand, so you can actually see what's in the walls. It's really fascinating. So of course the architecture of the building was interesting. That was like the first thing you read about, but then I kind of did more searching into deeds and then the proprietors and the owners. And that was even more fascinating. So it's just like every step you get hooked a little bit more. But so I could talk for hours about the proprietors, but I won't. I just kind of picked three just to give you an example of some of the types of people that owned it. Many people throughout the Colonial Inn's history, they owned the inn, but it might not have been their primary business. People had multiple jobs, which sounds crazy in today's world because it's hard to keep down one. So, so having multiple jobs was just kind of the thing to do at that time. So for example, Thomas Corbin, he owned it in 1908 to 1920. He actually passed away during his proprietorship in a car accident. But his main career was tobacco, and he had started, him and his family originally from Danville, Virginia, and they had started a tobacco plant in downtown Hillsborough, moved back to Virginia, and then him and his family moved to the Greensboro, Winston-Salem area and began a factory. And he represented American tobacco and went as far as Cuba as far, to do negotiations and whatnot. So it's fascinating that, he was a major player in the tobacco industry, but yet during his time, he owned the Colonial Inn. So that was really cool to see just that story. And then the other one is Paul Henderson, and he owned it in 1946 to 1952. For the Colonial Inn, he was championed because he did a major renovation. He installed the first phone lines in the Colonial Inn, and then actually put a few private restrooms in the bedrooms, which was unheard of at the time because they would have had communal bathrooms. So that was really neat to read about that renovation as she was going through this other renovation currently. He was also credited, they served food in the hall throughout its whole lifetime, but in the 40s, Paul Henderson was credited for adding the first formal dining room, which ended up being a bust and not making him much money. But before the Colonial Inn, before he owned that, he was the father of air aviation. So he had transplanted to North Carolina from Chicago and served in World War I. And he established the night air mail system so they could deliver messages overnight. And so he worked to bring lighting with General Electric to the airports and things like that. So I like to think he took part of my 2-day Amazon delivery. So we thank him for that. But and then the last one is James and Maxine Freeland. And they owned it from 1969 to 1976. The Freelands were known really close to Hillsborough for all the stuff that they built. The Colonial Inn wasn't the only historic property that they owned in the area, and then they built a ton of subdivisions and things like that. But what you might remember is the Daniel Boone Village. It was an amusement park of such, and attracted a lot of people. I wasn't here during that time, but I was told that there were live bison, which is crazy. Wax museum, antique stores, and then the amphitheater, brought in people like Ike and Tina Turner, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Loretta Lynn, which is crazy to think about. And so he owned the inn at the same time, and a lot of the acts that would come for him would eat at the Colonial Inn. So that was kind of cool. So it was just fascinating whenever you start to see these names and you start to research, each name, you find these fascinating backstories. And again, these people that came from different parts of the states came and they all owned the Colonial Inn and showed some love in one way or another. So going to the names, it had 4 different names. Orange Hotel, 1838, which is what it opened with. The Okanichi Hotel is 1885. If you're unfamiliar, Okanichi, which is misspelled here, not by me, but that's just how they spelled it. But it's the indigenous tribe that lived here before the European settlers. I really wanted to get to the bottom of why it was called the Okanichi Hotel, but I could never find anything that was related to it. The family that owned it at the time, her name was Emily Pogue, but she didn't have any ties. I talked to some of her descendants, and she doesn't have any ties to the tribe. So that still remains a mystery.
Amanda, you're frozen up. Can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me?
Now, yes.
Okay. Sorry. I don't know what happened there. It was weird. Okay. So anyway, so as I started interviewing people, I had done some digging that I could, and then I kind of opened myself up for outside comments. Can people tell me about the Colonial Inn and what have you, and tried to just collect some stories. And that's where the folklore came. So I got a few stories that I couldn't quite prove, which of course, over that many years, there's going to be things that pop up. So I thought I would share a few that were of interest to me. So General Cornwallis supposedly stayed there. Unfortunately, the dates, because he would have been there in the 1700s, the dates don't add up to the deeds, because we know that the inn was not erected until 1838. And so the old wives' tale goes that he was tired of the red clay being on his boots, and so he ordered the soldiers to pave the downtown roads of Hillsborough, especially the one that's right in front of the Colonial Inn. Now, I couldn't ever prove it, and we do know that General Cornwallis was stationed in Hillsborough, but there were so many taverns at that time that he could have been in any one of them, and so we know that the Colonial Inn wasn't erected then, which is unfortunate. And then I couldn't find any proof that he paved the cobblestones either, but what we do know is that the red clay is super annoying and does ruin your shoes. So perhaps there's some validity to that. But it's funny because almost every local tells that story and it has relation to the Colonial Inn. So I think that's funny. Other military people that are known or that are thought to have stayed there are George Washington, Aaron Burr, or his daughter Theodosia. Again, the dates don't add up because it would have been in the 1700s, but it's still being passed down. I've told people that the dates don't add up and they don't care. They keep telling people that George Washington stayed there and that Aaron Burr stayed there or his daughter stayed there before Aaron went back to England on a ship from New York. So what we do know about the property beforehand is that it was owned by a hatter. They purchased the land in 1803 and they built a family dwelling on there. They had a hatter shop, a house, a cemetery, all those fun things. That was the first known structure that was on there before 1803. On the maps and the surveys, it just is a wooded area. There's nothing that indicates that there was a building of any kind. There was a building that was next door, and it was owned by Edmund Fanning, but that was used as a law office of sorts. And so unfortunately, I haven't been able to prove that any of them stayed there. So I know that some of the locals are not going to be very happy with me. And then the other one I got was that Judy Garland stayed there, which who knows? Still to this day, I haven't yet talked to anyone that can give me a register of people. I've talked to a few previous owners, and they don't even know who stayed there when they owned it. So they couldn't tell me, for hundreds of years back who rested their head on their pillows. The other, I would say, legend has to do with the Civil War, and the Stroud family. They owned the Colonial Inn during that time, and the men, of course, were away at the Civil War, and so Sarah Stroud took care of the inn. It was during the latter part of the Civil War, so this would have been when Sherman's troops were stationed in Raleigh. So the legend has it that Sherman's troops were coming into Hillsborough to pillage the town, and Sarah did her best to hide everything that she could. Her and her 2 enslaved laborers hid the horses and tried to hide as much as the valuables as they could. But the soldiers came in anyways, and started taking everything, that was in sight. Sarah remembered that her husband had been a Freemason, which that building is still across from the Colonial Inn. And so she dashed upstairs with his Masonic apron in hand and threw it over the balcony. One of the Union soldiers was also a Mason, and so he stopped the pillage, told the men to return all the things, and then stationed guard to protect the Colonial Inn for the remainder of their stay. So she was credited with saving the inn. Again, we can't prove it. So I tried really hard. I was able to talk to some Freemasons, and I do know the Stroud men were a part of the Freemason fraternity. So could that have happened? Absolutely. So that one has a little bit more credit. It was passed down since the Civil War. It was actually written out by one of the daughters that was there at that time. So it's an oral history of sorts. So, but whether or not we can prove it, that'll still be remain. So it's kind of cool that you have this mystery over its hundreds of years, and these specific stories of these people, and that connects others to the Colonial Inn in unique ways. So unfortunately, though, all good things somewhat come to an end, and the fate of the Colonial was up in the air for a really long time, for about 20 years. So in 2001, the Colonial Inn was closed due to bankruptcy. It was owned by a family named the McKees, and they were deeply saddened, but the repairs and the works that needed to be done on the Colonial Inn were just way too overwhelming. And so they lost it in bankruptcy. It was purchased actually by accident, but that's a whole other story. In 2002, by a gentleman named Francis Henry. He was actually out of the States. His father had just passed away, and so he was on bereavement. And his lawyer saw that the Colonial Inn was going on for auction and purchased it with his money. That's the story that was told. So when he came back to the States, he owned the Colonial Inn. How about that for coming home? A welcome home present. So it was just, it was a lot of work that he wasn't necessarily prepared to do. And the property needed so much done just to make it appropriate. As the years went on, that checklist just kept growing. And the relationship between Henry and the town of Hillsborough really soured. He had threatened to bulldoze the property many times, which then down the road, Hillsborough was able to deem it a historically significant property. So it delayed that onset, and they were attempting to do eminent domain at that time. So in steps, again, the community. So a native resident named Christiana McKinnon, she had lived down the road and grew up on the steps of the Colonial Inn since she was a little girl, and she had watched, it fall in disarray. And so she created a Facebook group, that same Facebook group that in 2017 I had seen. So and she created this Facebook group called Save the Colonial, and it brought people together. They shared their stories, and they started really talking, what could we possibly do? So she held her first meeting at which is pictured right there, in 2014, and brought everybody together, and they just, started having a brainstorming session. And they were talking about Mr. Henry when a gentleman stood up in the back who happened to be Mr. Francis Henry, and he had came to the meeting. So he had followed the Facebook group. And they allowed him to share his side of the story, his frustrations with what was going on, what he wanted to do with the building. So Christiana paired up with another local resident named Bob Johnson, and they created the Colonial Inn Preservation Association. And that really served as like a task force and a mediator between Henry and the town. So they held fundraisers and meetings and even had petitions. So they really worked hard and to doing what they could to help fund the cause, to keep it, to keep it a viable business. They formed a bond with Mr. Henry and gave him that platform and helped calm the feelings. In a nutshell, it just seemed from their perspective that Mr. Henry really wanted to do good, but what needed to be done and what realistically could be done, it was just out of his scope of what he could accomplish. So it was this organization that I first stumbled on when I began looking at the history and just to see those stories that were shared in that community, and the fierce love behind the inn, it was astounding to me. So Henry decided to sell the property in 2017. As the sign went up, as a realtor is nailing in the sign, a woman by the name of Elise Tyler was across the street having coffee at Cup of Joe. And she ran over and said, "Can I have a walkthrough?" And the woman took her through, and she said, "All right." So she called her now business partners, who created Allied Death Corp LLC. And they took on this historic beast. They purchased the property in 2018. And since then, they've spent close to $9 million in its renovations. So a little bit more than what maybe one person could take on. But their partnership group, I think, has 4 to 5 couples on there. So they have a pretty good investment group that was able to do that. And of course, they took advantage of the tax incentives and other situations that they could. But it doesn't really compare to that 9 million number, in my opinion. They also added an additional structure for rooms to generate more revenue that was needed to sustain it. So that was a big part of it. But the renovations, they had asbestos, they had new roofing, they had to do masonry. So it was a feat. Even just getting the sidewalk in the front was difficult for them. And like I said, they're not the only ones to be applauded for their renovations. DC Parks in 1888, he's the one that added all of the ornate details. So if you can see in the picture of the right, it's much better to see than the other ones. But they have the piazza, the upstairs balcony has intricate detail, the window trim and the door trim, that was all added in 1888 and is kept into its original structure. And then of course I talked about Paul Henderson in 1946, our aviation master. He was also credited to doing large renovations, which is really cool. All right, so I'm going to just kind of flip through. It's like a timeline, so you can see the evolution of the property, which is kind of cool. But so the result of my research is my book, and you can say that I author it, but I don't say that I author it. I just collected the stories because my freelance writing skills are kept to a minimum. I write articles, I've done research, I've done website copy, but I'm not book worthy by any means. But I love writing and I love telling a story, and this gave me an opportunity to do that. The idea for the book came from the social media, the Facebook page that I mentioned. I just couldn't get over how many people were willing to share their memories and how many people bonded over the same memory, and they had never met each other. And so it was really cool. So the idea popped in my head when I was falling asleep, and I said, well, what if somebody just collected all these stories and put them in like a coffee table book? And in my mind, I'm thinking it's like a small Shutterfly book, and nothing big. So I just emailed the information email on the Allied Deaf Corps website and pitched the idea and had a coffee date with Elise. And she said, if you're crazy enough to do this, then go for it. So that's kind of what happened. So what began as a simple idea quickly spun out of control. And the interviews, spurred intrigue into the Inn's history, which then proved to be endless. I mean, over 100 years, almost 200 years of history is insane. But not only did I have stories from those who visited the Inn, so those simple stories that I saw on Facebook, but I also started getting people who worked at the Inn, and that was really interesting. And eventually descendants of people who worked at the Inn or people who had owned it, my great-great-grandmother, owned the Inn or whatever, those started coming out. So I was like, wow, there's a lot of people that are connected here. And I would talk to people in Hawaii and California, New York. And so it was astounding how big the Colonial Inn, we're a tiny town, so it was really cool. So before long, needless to say, my little Shutterfly storybook turned into like a real thing. And I could have collected stories forever and ever, but I had to cut it off. So after a year and a half of collecting and interviewing and digging, the book is finally in print. So hooray for that. So this is kind of a glimpse to the inside. The book takes readers through like a timeline of the Inn. So it shares biographical data of each of the owners, which was fairly easy to get. And I connected with a lot of descendants who thought it was funny that I was writing about their ancestor. But and then also capture stories from the workers of who I could get. So a lot of the workers, especially the cooks, they were African American. And so a lot of those details and those records are unfortunately lost. But I was able to speak to many people that brought forward that were descendants. And so that was really fun because those stories were much more personal than just, a search on Ancestry or newspaper.com. And the book is filled. The book ends with memoirs of those who have came. So weddings or events or honeymoons, what have you. So it's kind of ends on like that personal note. And there's newspaper clippings and never before seen photographs that help tell the Inn story. So it's somewhat of like a mix of oral history and biographical data, I guess you could say. So that is the Colonial Inn in a nutshell.
Well, thank you, Amanda. Does anybody have any questions?
I have an observation. Can you hear me, Amanda?
Yes.
The Hillsborough Rotary Club met there and only left when it closed down in 2001. So that back room was used, I think it was a Wednesday lunchtime, and we were there for a couple of years. So it's one of the many places we've met around town.
Oh, that's so cool. Yes. I see. And that's a story that I could have included in the book if I was kept writing.
There you go. That's for the next edition.
There you go. Oh my. That's so neat.
Well, I have a story. When we first moved down, my husband and I to North Carolina, we purchased the Oakwood Inn bed and breakfast in downtown Raleigh. And while we were running it, there was a story on the news that said that they were going to be tearing down the inn, but it was going to be open for people to go and see it. So my husband and I traveled to Hillsborough and walked through it, and we were just like, oh, this is so sad. It's such a beautiful place. But it was cool that we got to see it in disrepair. So now that it's open again, we'll have to go check it out because it was
yes.
Really cool.
Oh my God, please do. And let me know what you think. Because I don't have any ties. So I don't have any bias about what it used to be. So it's interesting. Some people are like, this is nothing like it used to be. And then other people are like, ooh, this is nothing like it used to be. So it'll be interesting to see, what you think, but how cool that you were be able to, walk through it. Was that when they had the auction? Did you get any goodies?
We did not get any goodies. We just walked through and it was just, we saw the ceilings falling down and all that stuff. It was just sad. It was sad.
It's so sad. And since you owned it, an inn, then you understand what goes through it. So that's crazy.
Yeah. How many rooms are in the inn?
Oh, darn it. I think in the original building, I believe there's 7. And then in the outback, I think it's 20.
Okay.
So that's how I understood it.
Cool.
I also remember going to eat when Pete Thompson owned it. Oh, the food was so delicious.
Okay, everyone that I spoke to always mentioned Pete Thompson and how much they loved him and how much of a character he was. And so it was really funny that I wish I could have met half of these people because they just sound hilarious. But the best quote, and I put this in the book, is that Pete Thompson always grumbled that he bought the inn twice. He first bought it when he leased it from James and Maxine Freeland, and then the second time was when he actually bought it. So I think he felt a little bit of like that it was his inn. And that's probably why so much character and love went in during his time. But everybody loved the Pete Thompson and the Crawford era. So those were the 2 big ones.
I have a suggestion if there isn't one already, please do a cookbook from the Colonial Inn.
I know, they printed one a long time ago. It was so the cook is named Annie Terrain, and she's the one that did like all the real famous, like the cobblers and the sweet potatoes, Cornwallis yams. And so the Crawfords had printed one, and we have 2 copies. And I have asked Elise, I said, are you guys going to make additional copies? I haven't heard a response, but maybe that'll be my next nudge, is like we get this reprinted.
Okay. And you can add the part about Rotary used to meet there.
There we go. Yes, Ray.
I just wanted to say thank you for the historical checks on like the land maps, the plats, and all that kind of stuff. No matter what the legends, it's always interesting to know what was or wasn't actually on things like maps and the like.
Yes.
I found that interesting. Having grown up there and eaten there, I heard all the same stories, and I'm sure I probably repeated some of them myself just because it's what you heard from everybody.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Well, thank you, because digging it was fascinating work. It was tiring, and I'd never done anything like this. I mean, I've always loved history, but and the pandemic, came out of nowhere for all of us, but it shut down Wilson's library at UNC. So a lot of the stuff that I feel I could have gathered, I feel I'm missing. So the fact that some things like the maps were digitized, I was so thankful for like NC Digital for that, because it made it accessible for me, or else I wouldn't have done the book. I mean, I just think if you're going to try to share some historical stuff, you need to have it in writing that this was what it was. I love the folklore. I think it makes intrigue, and it keeps you guessing what else happened. What else don't we know? But the facts are what they are. So thank you for that appreciation.
Yes, the digitization of records helps with a lot of things. And, that's just something that people didn't have before. So.
Yes, I found so many descendants because I got on ancestry.com. And so I would start looking at like, okay, I know this person died here, so let's trace it back. So then I would just reach out by email to these people that were related to like the owners. And they were like, how did you find me? Sorry. A little creepy there, but gotta love technology.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
Anybody else have any questions before we move on?
I have one more. Did they, when they were tearing out the walls and everything, because I saw some of the pictures during the restoration, did they find any interesting artifacts or anything hidden or?
Yeah. So, well, I don't know. They did find a safe. They found a safe behind the wall. Now, Elise tells me that there was nothing in the safe, but I don't believe her. I think she's lying, and I think that they're hiding it and they kept it for themselves. But they did find like a a safe that would have been hidden behind something. And so that was pretty cool. And then of course they found some things like in the attic, like old horseshoes that would have been on the door. So they kept those. Those are on display. And then they found railroad ties and spikes that were used for the foundation, and they kept those. They had to re-pour the foundation, of course, but they kept the original. They were like from the railroad. They were like huge spikes that were put into the foundation to keep it up. So that was interesting, and they have that framed too in their lobby.
Cool.
But no, like no bones of anybody were in the walls or anything like that. Not that she told me.
Well, cool.
Amanda, thank you. It's very interesting.
Yes, thank you very much.
All. Thank you.
Great job. All right. So, if we can go ahead, we got a lot of guests today. We'd like to know who you are and where you're from. And I'd start with Diana, but I don't think you're Diana.
I'm still working on how to get that changed. Yeah, I'm Barry Phillips. I'm with the Rotary Club of Hillsborough, and we've been residents in Hillsborough since 1991. So we claim this is our town.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for joining us. And Emily?
Hey there, I'm Emily Collins, and I live in Hillsborough. And I'm Rotary Club of Durham president for about 10 more days.
Well, welcome.
Thank you.
Hillary?
Hi, everyone. I'm Hillary. I'm with the Rotary Club of Hillsborough as well. Friends with Amanda, so I was so excited to see you today. And I wanted to mention, we also had Rick, who's our Rotary Club of Hillsborough president, and a Mason for the Eagle Lodge across the street from Colonial Inn. So there are a lot of connections here today.
Wonderful. And Ray, I know you've joined us before. You were a speaker, but if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself so everybody knows who you are.
Ray Lucas. I'm from Hillsborough originally, and but I live in Towson, Maryland now. So,
Okay.
thank you.
Well, thank you. And then the only announcement that I have is our year-end U party is Saturday. It's going to be on Zoom at 5 o'clock, and we're going to have a magician coming from England, who's going to be our guest for that event. So if you can, come on and join us.
Are you going to send that out? That link out?
Yeah. I'll
Okay.
send it out.
All right. Thanks.
All right. You're welcome. So I guess that will be it for today. We'll see you on Saturday. And we'll end with the 4-way test. And Carolyn, I'm going to have you do it.
No, you're not going to have me do it. You do it.
You want me to do it? I did the pledge. How about Matt? You can do it. How's that?
All right, I got y'all covered.
Thank you.
All right. The 4-way test of the things we think, say, and do. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all?
Great. Thank you, Matt.
Y'all want me to ring the Rotary bell?
Yes, please.
That's how we end our meeting.
Thank you.
Yeah, we usually do too, but I don't have the bell. So,
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Great job.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Amanda.